Should have worn my tall shoes today. Okay, so aloha. Thank you all for staying later in the day. I wanted to start my talk by acknowledging my collaborator, Luis Aristizabal, who's in the audience today. He is not only a coffee grower, but he is a CBB management expert. And he was really a key player in the early days of IPM development for CBB. Many of you probably remember he introduced the 30-tree sampling method. And so it made a lot of sense for me to collaborate with Luis on a monitoring project for CLR, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So after CLR was detected on Hawaii Island, Luis and I started reaching out to growers in Kona to see if they would be interested in participating in a monitoring program with us. The goals of the program were really threefold. We wanted to aid growers in the early detection of CLR on their farm so that they had a better chance of managing it. We wanted to characterize this disease across a broad elevational gradient, and we also wanted to collect information that could then be used to develop Hawaii-specific IPM guidelines for this disease. So in December 2020, we started our program. We ended up with 30 commercial coffee growers in the Kona district. They ranged all the way from North to South Kona, and we started visiting these farms on a monthly basis. We collected data on agronomic characteristics, CLR incidence, CLR severity, defoliation, management practices, and then we also, at the end of the year, calculated the costs to apply fungicides. So I just wanted to show you a detection timeline for CLR on Hawaii Island. So it was detected for the first time in Kona in November 2020. And by the time we started our monitoring program, more than 60% of farms in Kona were already infected. By the summer months, we were up to 87% positive in Kona, and then by November, so just within a year's time of the very first detection, all of the farms that we surveyed in Kona were CLR positive. In Ka'u, we made our first detection in September 2021. By December, we estimate that about 70% of farms were positive. And as of now, I think it's probably close to 100%. I only know of a handful of farms that don't have CLR in Ka'u. I think it's important to point out that almost every farm that we went to, before we went, we asked the grower, do you have CLR on your farm? And every single grower told us, no, we do not. And sure enough, when we went to these farms, they most certainly did have CLR. So there's a lot of confusion in how to identify it. As Lisa pointed out, there is a lot of confusion with Cercospora. The spots can look very, very similar. And so we really felt like it was important to get out there with the growers and really help them in the early detection of this disease. Oh, sorry, and I can't forget Hilo. So there's not as many coffee farms in Hilo, but we are surveying one farm, and we just detected CLR there for the first time a little earlier this year. So we're still monitoring that farm. It's at very low levels, probably less than 2% still. So for the rest of my talk today, even though I've talked a little bit about Ka'u and Hilo, I'm really going to focus on Kona because that's where the bulk of our data is from. We have, again, a little over a year's worth of data. So future talks, I would be happy to talk with you more about Ka'u and Hilo, but we're going to focus on Kona for today. So what did we find for agronomic characteristics? We sampled farms through a pretty broad elevational range, so about 600 meters. So 200 meter elevation was our lowest farm, and almost 900 meters was our highest farm that we surveyed. We had 6 low elevation farms, so these were farms below 1,300 feet. We had 14 mid-elevation farms, so these were between 1,300 and 2,000 feet, and then we had 10 high elevation farms, so these were farms above 2,000 feet. Varieties planted, I think we all know that most of what is planted out there is Typica, but we did have a handful of farms that had Caturra planted, and it's important to note that both of these are very highly susceptible to CLR. The planting density at these farms was pretty variable. It ranged from 450 to 1,500 trees per acre. On average, it was about 820 trees. And the reason I point this out is the number that I've seen, at least, for the optimal planting density for Typica is around 725. So, you know, on average, farms in Kona have a little bit of a higher planting density than you would like for the Typica variety. Age of trees was also super variable, so we had trees as young as 3 years old, all the way past 100 years old. I mean, some growers don't even know how old their trees are, right? These are quite old trees, and we know from the literature in other countries that there's increased susceptibility to CLR as you get past 20 years, really. Most of the farms are grown in full sun. There are about 30% of farms that we surveyed that had partial shade. Most farms were conventionally managed, so using a variety of chemical fungicides and pesticides, and only about 23% of farms were organically managed. Okay, so getting into some data. I'm going to use the term incidence, and if you're not familiar with incidence, you can just think of it as the presence of visible CLR infection on the leaves. So when we went to these farms, we inspected anywhere from 700 to 1,000 different leaves on any given sampling date, and we looked at those leaves for CLR lesions. If we found CLR lesions on those leaves, we counted those as present. Okay, so you can think about incidence as the presence of infection on the leaves for that given sampling date. We separated, again, the farms into 3 different elevations. So the light brown bars are low elevation. In the middle green bars are mid elevation, and the dark green are high elevation. What I want you to see on this graph is that for the first 6 months of the year, low, mid, and high elevation farms all had pretty low incidence, so less than 5%. And then when we get into July and August, we started to see a spike in incidence, and then as we got into the peak harvest season, incidence really took off. And you will note that in particular, incidence was very high for mid and high elevation farms. So we only have 1 year of data, so it's too early to say if this trend is going to hold, but I think it's interesting to note. It could be that mid and high elevation farms are going to always have a higher pressure from CLR. It's a little early to say, but I think it's something to keep in mind. On the other side of that, the low elevation farms, you know, on average were above 20% incidence at the end of the year. So just because you have a low elevation farm doesn't mean that you should not very aggressively manage this disease. So bottom line, CLR is pretty darn happy no matter what elevation you're at, and you do have to actively manage it year round, as Lisa pointed out. I'm going backwards. There we go. Okay, so this is a compilation graph. We've got incidence, severity, and defoliation. So severity, Lisa and Andrea talked a little bit about this. It's just the area of the leaf that's covered by CLR lesions. So the picture at the top shows a leaf with just a couple spots, so we'd consider that low severity. Maybe it's around 1 or 2%. And the picture on the bottom is very high severity. So once you get really past 20 to 30% severity, I'd consider that pretty high, because that's when you start to see defoliation. The green bars are the number of leaves per branch. You can see that early in the year, really before CLR took off, on average, leaves per branch was about 20. That stayed that same way all the way to the end of the year until incidence and severity started to take off, and then you see the defoliation really set in, and we lost about 50% of all the leaves off of our trees. That has stayed the same for the last few months. If you've driven around Kona lately, you have noticed that it's really only in the last month that we've started to see a new leaf flush with the rain that we've been getting. So the numbers, have gone up a little bit, but I think we should not be complacent. This is probably just part of the CLR cycle, and we're going to see a new fresh load of CLR germination. So it's important to not think that the trees are recovered and that everything is fine, because it's probably not. It's just part of the cycle. So I just wanted to show you some pictures of what we were seeing in the field to really drive the point home of how bad it has gotten in Kona. So these pictures are all from the same farm in Holualoa, which was probably one of the hardest hit areas. In February, we really didn't see many spots. I think incidence at this point was maybe only 2 or 3%. And then as we got into May, it was up to 15%. We started to see the occasional spot here and there. And then once we got into August, it got really, really bad really quickly. I know of some farms that were only at 5% incidence, and all of a sudden the very next month they were at 50% incidence. So something really triggered a huge boost in CLR across the entire district. We started seeing a lot of fresh germination, and we started to see a lot of tissue necrosis, which you can see on the picture on the left. So that's tissue death. And not long after that, we started to see defoliation on the lower branches of the trees, which you can see in September. And then as we get into October and November, we started to see defoliation in the mid-canopy. Most of the trees still kept their leaves at the very top, but it looked pretty dire there for a while. We were looking at farms of sticks for quite a few months, and it's really, as I said, only in the last few months that we've started to see some new leaves on the trees. I'll get the hang of this clicker by the end. And again, this is the same farm, and I just wanted to show you this because it's important to point out that this is not normal defoliation. I've had growers argue with me and say, well, you know, we always see defoliation. We have pickers come through and leaves get pulled off the trees, and the trees are tired because they've had a really high fruit load that year, and they drop some leaves, and that's normal. But this is definitely not normal. We've been following these farms since 2016, and we have really good photo documentation of the health of these trees for many years now. So you can see in 2016 and 2018, so wet years and dry years, it doesn't matter. The trees look really great. And then this last year, you know, that tree looks horrible. It doesn't have any leaves. It's got plenty of berries, but no leaves. So what were people doing to manage CLR on their farms? I realize now you probably can't see the numbers, so I'm going to tell you. So 27% of farms did sanitation pruning. So after we told them that they had CLR on their farms and we showed them hot spots, 27% of growers went out to those areas and physically removed leaves and branches that were infected. All of the farms did a pretty good job of weed management, but it was pretty variable. You know, there were some months here and there where the weeds did get fairly tall. But overall, all of the farms did try to do some weed management, whether it was manual or herbicide. 97% of farms applied preventative and or curative fungicides. So these were things like Coside, Serenade, Oxidate were probably the top 3 that we saw applied. Only 20% of farms applied a translaminar fungicide, and this was only done once or twice, as opposed to the preventatives and curatives, which were applied anywhere from 3 to 10 times. For the farms that had partial shade, only 50% of those did shade management. So if they had fairly high CLR numbers under a particularly dense shade tree, they did go through and cut some of those lower branches just to improve airflow and solar radiation in those areas. And actually, it did really well to decrease incidence and severity under those shaded areas. And then lastly, at the end of the year, in response to really high incidence and severity, about 30% of farms did some stumping or heavy pruning. And then lastly, I wanted to just show you what the costs of fungicides are that you can expect in the coming years. Hopefully things get cheaper, but at least for this first year, you know, unfortunately we only got really good data from 7 farms out of the 30. We also learned that growers don't always keep the best management records, so I think that's an area that we really need to help growers improve in. I think it will help in the way that they just manage their farm overall. But anyway, we got data from 7 farms. 4 of these used backpack sprayers, not because they wanted to, but because the terrain was really rough and rocky, and that's what they had to work with. 3 farms used tractor sprayers, And so to estimate the total cost to spray fungicides per acre, we looked at a number of things. We looked at the number of fungicide sprays that were done. We looked at the cost of the products that they used. We looked at the labor costs, and then we also included the cost to monitor those farms. So that's what that first red box is. We found that the total cost to spray fungicides range anywhere from $450 to $1,167 per acre. We also found that the tractor cost per spray was a little bit cheaper at $90 to $100 versus a tractor sprayer, which was, backpack sprayers were more expensive at $106 to $150 versus a tractor sprayer, which was a little cheaper at $90 to $103. And then we also wanted to know what % of profits were growers spending to cover the cost to spray these fungicides. So we looked at yield per acre, and then we also looked at the profit per acre. And we estimate that the % of profits spent to cover costs for a tractor sprayer was 2 to 3% versus a backpack sprayer, which was 4 to 11%. Okay, and so one of these last slides I wanted to show you is research that I'm doing currently in my lab and kind of what I'm not shifting my focus to. We're still going to continue to do the monitoring at least for the next few years, but we need to start thinking about how we're going to use this monitoring data to improve CLR management in Hawaii. And something that I'm really interested in is predictive modeling, so we can forecast these outbreaks. Other countries have been doing this for many, many years. There are actually many, many models out there. So my task now is to sift through these models and find something that we can use as a starting point and then adapt it to our specific conditions here in Hawaii. So I have found a model that looks pretty promising. It's pretty simplified. There are a number of finite inputs. So things like weather management, plant phenology, genetic resistance, and CLR incidents go into the model. So we have all that data. That's great. We've got weather stations at all of these farms, so it's something that we can go ahead and do right now. And we're hoping that we can start to see if it correctly predicts the data that we collected last year. And so we're running those models now and working to adapt them because we do have things on our weather stations like leaf wetness, which is very important for these models. That actually hasn't been incorporated to any of the existing models yet. So there are ways that we can improve these very simplistic models to our conditions here in Hawaii. In my lab, we're also characterizing CLR spore viability in the field. This is something that Lisa Keith's lab has been helping us with. We are looking to see if spores have different viability levels if they're in the sun versus in the trees that are in the shade. We're also looking at different levels of the canopy, so do spores that are lower down have higher viability versus spores that are higher up in the canopy? So those are the kinds of questions we're hoping to answer there. And we're also looking at CLR dispersal through the wind. There's a lot of papers in the literature that talk about spores being blown, thousands of miles across the ocean, or that CLR is easily dispersed through the wind. So far, we haven't caught much of anything in these spore samplers that we've had set up, so it's possible that wind is not as big of a dispersal factor as we thought it could be. And as Lisa pointed out, it could be more so, people and animals and vehicles and rain splash. But again, it's a little early to tell. We're hoping by the end of this year we'll have a little bit of a better understanding of that. And then lastly, we are looking at natural predators of CLR. So there is a midge fly that lays its eggs on these rust lesions, and the larvae actually feed on the spores. So if you have high incidence and severity at your farm, you probably have these because we've seen them every farm that has pretty high incidence and severity. These midge larvae are there. And so we're trying to quantify, not only ID them first and make sure that it is what we think it is, and we're also looking at different potential host plants around the farms. But we're also interested in, in how many spores these midge larvae can actually ingest. And the flip side of that is, do these larvae actually disperse spores across the leaves? And we're not sure yet, but it's a very interesting question that we're just starting to look at. That is all that I have for you today. Oh, I did make a little video. That's our spore sampler blowing in the wind, not catching much of anything. Thanks so much to all of you for being a great audience. I'd like to thank, first and foremost, my field technicians. This has been really hard work. They drive from Hilo to Kona every week. And so it's very long 10-hour field days for them, and they've just been spectacular in collecting this very important data. Thanks to all the growers that have been in our monitoring program, and please feel free to contact me with any questions that you might have. Thanks so much.
Hello, thank you. I know we're kind of running behind schedule a little bit, so I'm going to just briefly give you an update. The advantage of going last is that a lot of the information has already been covered. So, okay, here we go. Okay, so as you heard this morning from Vern's talk, we are very fortunate to be a participant in the International Multi-Location Trial. Variety trial, and this is in collaboration with World Coffee Research as well as HARC. So this is where you get, they were able to compile varieties from around the world, and then we imported them into Hawaii. So just to give you an idea of what the timeline is, so we actually had started trying to get the material before coffee leaf rust was here, and so hindsight is 2020, but anyway. So, but the plants did arrive in September 2020, which was like only a month before coffee leaf rust was first found. So, yeah, that was kind of a bummer. But anyway, so right now what we're doing, so the original goal was we were going to plant it in one field on Kauai before coffee leaf rust, and thanks to World Coffee Research agreeing, because we did get coffee leaf rust here, we're able to expand that now to four different locations along the island chain. And so along with that, what we're also doing is multiplying these lines to see if we can get these out a little bit faster. So just to give you an idea of what the lines are, so we do have the susceptible lines as well as some that are either classified as tolerant or resistant by the World Coffee Research. And so if you can look online at that, at the catalog that Vern had talked about this morning, you can see more information on a lot of these varieties. So what we're also doing, in addition with for these lines, is we're also looking at importation of other varieties through a controlled import permit. So as Helmeth had talked to you about earlier, coffee is not allowed to be brought into the state, and so we are in the process of getting an application to import a few varieties for testing. We're also going to be a collaborator with World Coffee Research to look at some new material that we could breed for material here. And we're also working with Nestle, or we're in discussions with Nestle to see if we can test some of their varieties here as well. So the one thing that these all have in common, if you notice, is that they're going to all come in from different places, which means, well, they have a one-year quarantine. So what we're also trying to do is work with what's available here. And so this is a great collaborative effort with HARC. And so Ming-Li will give you more information about this tomorrow. But we're collaborating with them on a catamore-based resistance with elite Hawaiian lines. And then also we're looking for coffee leaf rust varieties that might already be here in Hawaii as well. And so through a great participation, so one of the coffee growers was able to see that this is a coffee leaf in his field, that he noticed that there are some plants that are more resistant. And so you can see in February, and it's more striking, you see in May, the two green coffee plants that are very, very, no defoliation, they look nice, green, and healthy. And so what we did is we are propagating these lines. So we sent the CLR-resistant lines, and we're getting them genotyped by Dr. Daopeng Zhang at ARS in Beltsville. I asked him if, and he told me we'll know in a few more days, or he'll send me the results in a few days. So I'll keep everyone posted as to where they fall in the classification. And these lines we also vegetatively propagated, so we grafted them, as well as we gave leaf tissues to Dr. Mike Shintaku, who Andrea had talked about earlier. And so these lines are in tissue culture for somatic embryogenesis. So because that's such a long process, we wanted to get that in right away, so while we're still doing some other evaluations, those materials would be available faster, hopefully. And so just to reemphasize a point that Lisa had already made, so Dr. Bereza was instrumental in actually doing the coffee leaf rust differential testing for us. So he was the researcher in Portugal that was able to just tell us that we have race 24 in Hawaii. And so one of his caution messages was to be sure that although we have the resistant varieties, we still want to continue to spray and do a spray rotation, because we know that the Himalaya Vestatrix has a high potential for evolutionary potential to become resistant. And so he has already done a study in which germplasm is often where you would also get a lot of your resistant varieties. So because we are going to be host for the coffee leaf rust, the coffee germplasm material, we are taking this very seriously, and so we are doing an active management program, even though we don't have coffee leaf rust at the moment. I guess I should knock on wood. So looking for the future, we were actually very, very fortunate to be working with Dr. Chifumi Nagai, and together with the Hawaii coffee growers, they had started a lot of this work that Ming-Li is going to talk about tomorrow. But through her proactive efforts, we do have a lot of the germplasm material here, and then so kind of building upon what she was looking at, now we kind of want to look at the future. So we had a great meeting with the people from WCR, as well as we're hoping to be a part of the Breeding Insights, which is a program that will help us hopefully streamline and get the breeding populations a little bit faster. And together with our new hire for our research geneticists, we're hoping to be able to speed up the breeding process to get to the genes of interest a lot faster. And we also have, thanks to your support, we have funding for a new plant breeder that will hopefully bring this all together. So as everyone had mentioned, I guess teamwork is dream work. So we're very, very fortunate to have a wonderful team and everyone working together. With that, these are some of the key institutions that have been helpful in bringing this all together, because as Vern had mentioned this morning, the more global people you can look at it, a problem, you can solve it a lot better. So, and with that, I just want to thank everybody, because our unit, everyone contributes so well to working together. And with that, any questions?